Hello guys, just wanted to put together a video for the class, just going over some of the annotations. Obviously, we don't have the time to go over things with any class time. We've got a fair bit of downtime until the HHD exam, so I thought just putting these videos out for you will sort of help you understand the key concepts in the textbook that we've annotated. As I mentioned in class, I'm going to be going over. I'm going to be going over each of the key concepts from chapters 1 through to 6, and I'll be putting them up every day or so. So I'll start off with chapter 1 and just really pay attention to the key concepts that I do go over, because I'm obviously going over them for a reason, because they're fairly relevant to what's going to be on the exam. All right, so it's really just about consolidating your key knowledge and making sure if there's any gaps in your knowledge or things you might have forgotten over time, you can sort of fill those and be well prepared for the exam. So you can follow along this document yourself. It's been uploaded to the OneNote. And effectively, all I've done is I've just annotated sticky notes on parts of the textbook that I think are really relevant. Obviously, you want to read the corresponding parts of the textbook, but you can just use the sticky notes that I've put on there for you. That can just basically be notes that you take down, or at the very least, you can at least watch this video and just digest some of the content that I'm giving to you if you don't want to take notes. Best bet is you taking notes, but if you can't get that done or you're a little bit strapped for time, the next best thing will just be watching this video and just digesting some of the content and sort of reintegrating some of that key knowledge that we learned earlier in the year. So the first thing that we're going to go over, which is really simple and something you need to understand, is the WHO definition of health from 1946. So the WHO definition from health that we're referring to, that's from 1946, is the definition that states that health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease and infirmity. You do need to know this definition. You need to know this definition in year 11. You need to know it in year 12. Question that's going to show up on SACs exams. It's a common question, so it's a good idea to know it. But you need to know a little bit more than just remembering this definition. You need to be able to analyze it and unpack it a little bit. As you can see, it's quite an old definition. So there's a little bit to unpack there in terms of its strengths and its limitations. What makes it a good definition of health? What are some of the limitations that it has that makes it not such a good definition of health? Well, we've added some annotations here that speak about some of the strengths. So first of all, it mentions that health is a state of being. So it's not merely the absence of illness, it's an overall state of being. When we refer to that state of being, we're referring to those 5 dimensions of health. You've got to have some form of health and well-being across those 5 dimensions to be considered to be in a healthy state. It's not just down to being physically fit. You need to be mentally well. You need to have a good social support network. You need to have spirituality. You need to have all these things to be in a state. So it's showing that it's a holistic concept. It's not just focusing on one area of health, but balancing out the 5 areas of health, these 5 dimensions. So that's one of the strengths, the fact that it refers to health as a state. So it demonstrates that health isn't just not having a disease, it's having adequate health across these 5 dimensions, and that creates the healthy and balanced state. But what are some of the limitations? Well, some of the limitations are that the term sort of implies that you need to have complete physical, mental, and social well-being. So it's the term complete in there, which is sort of the limitation. So in order to have a high level of health, according to this definition, you need to have complete physical, social, and mental well-being, which sort of gives you the sense that you need to have an optimum level across these 3 dimensions. We know that that's not necessarily accurate. You're not going to have all of your dimensions of health at an optimum level, so it's somewhat giving you an unrealistic idea of what a healthy state of health and well-being is. You need to have a high level across all 3 dimensions. You don't necessarily need to have a high level across all 3 dimensions to be considered healthy, and it certainly doesn't need to be optimum across all three dimensions. So this definition that they're given there, using the term complete, sort of creates an unattainable definition of health, or a definition to be considered healthy. So that's a limitation of it, the fact that the way it's worded can actually make that health seem somewhat unattainable. All right. We'll move on to the next part. All right. Once again, not really super important, because I feel like this is something that's pretty self-explanatory. The 5 dimensions of health, health refers to the 5 dimensions of health, and well-being refers to that sort of overall holistic state of balance and equilibrium where we feel happy and engaged and we can go about our daily activities easily. And then health and well-being is just a combination of those two things. So I've got that there in the notes. Realistically, I hope that you sort of understand this. You understand the difference between health and well-being. All you need to remember to understand this is that health is the 5 dimensions, well-being is the overall state. Right? So that's what you need to understand. And then health and well-being is the combination of the two definitions. So it's a simple concept. If you get asked what well-being refers to, make sure that you refer to the fact that it's the equilibrium, it's the state, it's that holistic balance of health, whereas health is just the 5 dimensions. How healthy are you in 5 dimensions, and what is the cumulative effect of those 5 dimensions of health? I haven't taken down these factors affecting health and well-being because they're pretty self-explanatory and we don't really need to know them, and they're embedded in the 5 dimensions of health themselves. So the first one we're looking at is the physical dimension of health. Really important when we're looking at the physical dimension of health is that we're referring to these characteristics when we're answering SAC and exam questions or any questions for that matter. So if you get a question about someone that has a poor diet, they overconsume energy dense foods, they overconsume fats, carbohydrates, these sorts of things. And you talk about, well, what are their implications for their physical health? You could just say they could become overweight and they may develop type 2 diabetes or cardiovascular disease. That's an okay answer. But you want to be really specific in signposting the characteristics when you give these answers. So always stay fairly close to referencing 1 or 2 of these 7 characteristics. So if you're explaining that response again, you're talking about someone over-consuming energy-dense foods, you're saying, okay, if they over-consume energy-dense foods, this could affect the functioning of their body systems and organs, such as their cardiac health. This could cause cardiac issues such as high blood pressure, hypertension, increased risk of stroke. So I'm doing 3 things there. I'm identifying what's happening. I'm signposting 1 of these characteristics. So I'm taking 1 of the 7 characteristics. Then I'm linking it to some sort of health outcome. Especially in our larger mark questions, we always want to be linking back to a health outcome. So if you get a question about dimensions of health, the first thing you want to do is identify what's happening, identify what the health issue is that's been identified. It will be identified for you in the question, but you've got to identify it for it. You've got to identify it in the answer, and then identify which characteristic that applies to, and then talk about a health outcome, especially in the larger mark questions. If you don't talk about a health outcome or a health consequence linking on from 1 of these characteristics, then you're not going to get those full marks. The people that do those 3 things are the people that have the high tier responses and they always get full marks. If you just leave 1 of those things out, yeah, it might be a good response, but you might get 2.5, 2 out of 3, because examiners and when we're marking SACs, we're trying to separate those really high tier responses from those mid-tier responses. And obviously you want to be at that high tier response, but not everyone can be. How you get yourself as close as possible is making sure that you're covering those 3 bases in a question like this. So always answering in more depth, clearly signposting things that you see from the textbook. They're easy ways to get the people that are marking your work to identify, yes, this person knows the content, they know what they're talking about. That's what you need to do. I've given an example of this here, and I've just mentioned what I explained about the signposting, but I've used the example of someone over-consuming sodium. They're going to show poorer body function, or so they're going to show poorer function in terms of their body systems and organs. And then I'm giving an actual example, a health outcome. For example, this individual will have increased blood pressure. Blood pressure is just cut off there, but if you click into the note, you'll see that's what it says. Right, moving on. Once again, I'm just reiterating once when you're answering exam questions, you need to signpost each dimension. In terms of what you need to know, to be prepared, you don't need to know all 5, if there's 5 in this case, or for physical, you don't need to know all 7. But if you can go, you can go into the exam understanding, minimum 2, at least 3 or 4, you're going to be well placed. And 3 I'd say is a good number, because then depending on the question you get, you can draw to that type of characteristic without making it incorrect, without it being an incorrect comparison. So always try and go on with 3 or 4 that are solidified in your memory that you can draw upon depending on what the question calls for. Right, so now we're looking at emotional well-being. So emotional well-being, emotional health and well-being. I feel like, me personally, I'm going to be pretty disappointed if people are getting lots of questions wrong on dimensions of health, because I feel like it's a relatively easy topic, and we spent enough time with it for you to understand. But if anyone's going to make a mistake, it's probably going to be on emotional health and well-being. All right. So the main mistake that we make is that we sometimes get emotional health and well-being and mental health and well-being slightly mixed up. And I know they're closely interrelated and they can overlap in practice, but in terms of health and human development, we need to make sure we keep these concepts separate, because even though you might be right in terms of how you're expressing yourself, it's not correct to the terminology that we use in health and human development, and obviously not to get the marks. So that's something you need to be mindful of. So when answering questions related to emotional health, really stick closely to these 4 characteristics and try not to go away from them. Why I say stick closely is because they clearly stick to emotional health and well-being, and they don't drift off into mental health and well-being. One of the characteristics you cite, albeit might be might be somewhat correct, if you drift off into that mental health and well-being dimension, you're going to lose marks. So first one, recognizing and understanding a range of emotions, managing emotions and responding to emotions, being able to experience appropriate emotions and manage emotions in different scenarios, and having resilience. So resilience is something that's categorized within emotional health and well-being. It's not part of mental health and well-being. Okay. So mental health and well-being is anxiety, stress, thought processing. If it has to do with someone's thoughts, that's going to be mental health and well-being. If it has to do with feelings and in turn managing those feelings, then that's emotional health and well-being. So always make sure you're making that differentiation so you're not losing easy marks by getting emotional and mental mixed up. Now, I've just mentioned here that emotional security could also be used as a response, because once again, you're staying closely to that emotional concept. Keeping the term emotions within your answer is actually a good way to make sure that you're retaining a focus on emotional health and well-being and not mental health and well-being. So that's just a little tip. Right, so when we're doing case study questions and we're talking about emotional health and well-being, we're assessing a scenario, and just say it's someone that is potentially getting bullied at school. That's what we're looking at. That's what the case study is about. And we talk about how their emotional health and well-being could be affected. Well, in the response, we're going to signpost these characteristics. We're going to say because they're experiencing bullying at school, it's becoming very difficult for them to manage their emotions in this situation, because it's a very emotionally testing situation. And then I'm going to use some evidence about some emotions that they might be feeling. So they might be feeling some emotions like anger, disgust, embarrassment, anxiety. These are some of the different emotions that they're feeling. So what you want to do, you want to signpost the characteristic, and then you want to use some of the emotions that they're feeling that's represented in the case study to back up your answer as evidence. Once again, this is how teachers are going to separate those top tier marks, because you're using evidence and you're fully explaining things in comparison to the people that just say, okay, Johnny's getting bullied at school and it's difficult for him to manage his emotions. I'm not giving any explanation why. Why is it difficult to manage his emotions? What emotions is he feeling? Always try and go to that next level, especially if there's 2, 3, 4 marks in the question. Generally, if there's 2, 3, 4 marks, we're asking for more. Your one-sentence statement is not going to be enough to get you 4 marks, because it's a 3-mark question. And you just say, Johnny finds it difficult to manage his emotions. That's not going to cut it for 3 marks. Okay, so you're going to see the people that go above and beyond and use evidence, and the people that get the higher marks in terms of those questions. So some of you might need to apply that into some of your responses. So once again, this is not so much knowledge that you need to remember and regurgitate facilitate on the exam, but more or less it's things to be mindful of when you're answering questions so you have the right approach and you're not losing marks when you know the content. That's the frustrating part. You know the content, but you don't approach the answer correctly, or you don't approach the response correctly, and you lose those easy marks. So just make sure we're approaching that with the right mindset and take note of some of the things that I've said during this video, even if it's just a mental note. All right, so once again, I'm just going back over, I'll keep this pretty quick. Not confusing emotional components when you're talking about mental characteristics. Don't say the person feels sad or they're emotionally unstable or something like that. Yes, you may go on to link it to some form of stress or anxiety, which would be correct, but just stay away from that emotional terminology when you're answering something that's specific about the mental dimension of health. Try and refer to things like self-esteem, how someone perceives themselves. Levels of stress and anxiety are really easy to link to lots of situations. Confidence is another one that's really easy to link to different situations. Thought patterns, being positive, processing information, those sorts of things, use of logic and reasoning, anything that comes to do with your thoughts and your processing and how you approach things mentally, that comes under mental health and well-being. What you experience and you feel, that's your emotional health and well-being. So just make sure that you keep those as separate as possible, because that's the main place that we're tripping up as a class and I guess as a cohort in terms of these sorts of questions. All right, spiritual health and well-being. So spiritual health and well-being, like when we get a case study question, that's the one we're always searching for. We're going, well, how do we relate this case study to spiritual health and well-being? What's the person experiencing? Well, there's a few characteristics that are actually easy to link to lots of situations. So sense of purpose and sense of belonging are two great ones to go, because they can be applied and justified to most health situations. So the example I've given here is if someone undergoes a drastic change in health and therefore their lifestyle actually has to change and they can't do the things that they're used to doing, whether it's their daily activities, their sport, their exercise, their career, and they start to lose in that department, then what's their sense of purpose in life? They're starting to lose a sense of purpose in life. They don't, those familiar places, they're starting to lose a sense of belonging. So you can link that really easily. So when you get those case studies and you're not too sure, okay, how am I gonna justify and explain that spiritual well-being, health and well-being is being affected here? If you look to sense of purpose and you look to sense of belonging, they're going to be the easiest ones to make that link and to justify it. Certainly, I'm not against you using the other ones. If you can use the other ones, and I encourage you to use the other ones, that's what is called for in the situation. But I'm just letting you know that sense of purpose and sense of belonging and connection to the world are probably two easiest ones to focus on if you have difficulty connecting health situations in terms of the spiritual dimension of health. So I just wanted to give you that little tip. Also, had a look at one of the questions. So question 3, we've got outline one way a person could enhance their spiritual health and well-being. You need to try and speak about how spiritual techniques could enhance someone's health and well-being. So this is actually a little bit more of a difficult question because we spoke about linking situations. Someone's had an injury, now they can't fulfill their career, so they don't have a sense of purpose. We've spoken about that before. But how does one actually enhance their spiritual health and well-being? So think about some practices that can help with mindfulness and peace and belonging and purpose. Think about some practices that could be religion or that could be spiritual techniques like meditation and mindfulness and those sorts of techniques, which may actually assist someone in improving their spiritual health. All right, so we've spoken about that other side where something bad happens to someone and their spiritual health declines because they can't engage with their normal lifestyle. Now we need to look at, okay, what can people also do to enhance their spiritual health and well-being? This is something you will come across in an exam or a SAC, and it might catch you a little bit off guard because you might not answer a lot of questions or have a lot of discussion on a topic like this. And you might, your first your first instinct might be to come up with something basic like, oh, they can go to church or they can go and pray. It's all right. It's a little bit too basic. It's not going to get you full marks. You need to show that you understand the components of spiritual health. Now we're going to look at youth perspectives. No? So I'll just quickly go to charge over. So youth perspectives are really important in terms of health and well-being because you're going to get a lot of case study questions that are based around youth. How can the particular factors and perspectives and variations in perspectives from youth in comparison to adults and to the older population, how can that affect specifically this group's, this age demographics, health and well-being? So this is something you need to consider, and this is something you need to be able to explain and analyze. So the first you're going to draw attention to is that when you're referring to youth perspectives, to most simply respond to most of the questions, you want to refer to, or at least have in your mind, the most common issues that young people face in terms of their health and well-being. So it'd be a good idea to take down some of these, some of the common issues that young people face in figure 1.19, because you can draw upon these in a lot of your responses because they're very applicable to a whole range of situations. So, whatever case study question you get, if you look at the top 5 big concerns, or the major concerns for young people, they're probably going to be applicable to most situations, most study questions, case study questions you answer. So coping with stress, mental health, body image, school or study problems, and physical health. One thing I wanted to mention is that body image, in terms of it being part of the dimension of health. So some of us think that body image is part of the physical dimension of health, and we think that's the way that youth perspectives differ in terms of physical health. Because okay, how does a younger person's perspective on their physical health differ from an older person? And then someone might say, oh, that individual is a bit more concerned about body image. But that would be incorrect because body image is part of the mental dimension of health. So body image refers to someone's perception of their own body, not their actual body. Okay, because someone's perception might be different than the aesthetics of the body that they actually have. So if you were to speak about youth perspectives and you wanted to speak about someone's body and body image and how they look, if you wanted to talk about it physically, make sure you use a term like body aesthetics. Okay, so how they look to others, the actual structure of their body and the physical fitness of their body in terms of how they look. So body aesthetics. You want to talk about youth perspectives for physical health? If you said body aesthetics, that's completely fine. If you want to talk about youth perspectives for mental health, make sure you refer to body image if it's applicable. Don't put body image in physical health because it is not physical health. Body image is mental health, someone's perception of their own body. So it's just something that's important to note so you don't get that mixed up on an exam. Okay, that's what I've mentioned there. So that's in the notes there if you want to take that down. Even if you watch these videos and you take down some of the notes, obviously I'm not going to stay over all of these, so you can take down the notes as you watch the video. You want to have the notes up on your own screen so you can have a look at them. But even if you watch the video and you just watch it at 1.5 speed, so you can digest what I'm saying to you, you can understand some of the content. and understand some of the explanations, take down some key notes. It's going to be, I can't explain how beneficial this is going to be for you, just to reconsolidate that key knowledge, because it's very easy to forget things once they're 4 or 5 weeks in the past, out of sight, out of mind. So it's really important to reconsolidate. And answering questions is going to be a large component of what you do, completing your revision booklet, but also going back over some of these key notes and having it in a structured way like this and using these annotations is going to be the best way, because you're taking notes that are relevant. You're not just taking down random notes. Some of the random notes you might be taking down from the textbook if you're just going through it. This might be stuff that would very rarely show up on an exam or very rarely show up on a SAT. Even in year 12, you might be studying the wrong thing. So it's important to focus your energy mostly on what's important to study. All right. So I'm just drawing attention to question 3. I'm going to quickly go over question 3 because it's certainly a question you could get on a SAT only exam. All right. So as listed, 5 issues of concern for youth regarding their health and well-being: depression, body image, family conflict, coping with stress, school or study problems. So you'll notice that these are all different dimensions of health. So depression would refer to the mental dimension of health. Body image refer to the mental dimension of health. Family conflict would refer to relationships, so predominantly the social dimension of health. Stress would be mental. And school or study problems would be mental. Okay, so it's mostly mental with one social. Briefly explain one of these issues of concern and identify the dimension of health and well-being is most likely to affect. So we've identified there's 4 mental and 1 social. So the one that I'm looking at is body image. Youth might be concerned with the way their body looks, how they may feel, that they're carrying too much weight or potentially too short, or they might be unhappy. They might be unhappy their peers developing their peers are developing quickly. They're potentially looking better than them through their own perception, and this can take a toll on their self-esteem and their confidence levels and impacting mental health and well-being. So I want to draw something fairly important in how this question's answered. So notice how they mention characteristics of what body image is. So that's the first thing they do. So they're very clearly getting the 2 marks. Like they're getting the 2 marks. If this is a 2-mark question, this response is getting the 2 marks easily. This was a 3-mark question, probably getting the 3 marks if it were to be 3 marks, but it's getting 2 marks really easy. It's explaining what body image is. So it's giving you an explanation of what body image is. So that's 1 tick. Mentioning that it can affect some characteristics of mental health and well-being. So they could have done this either way. The first thing they've done, they've mentioned the characteristics it affects. The 2 characteristics they've mentioned are self-esteem and confidence. So take note that the response does this. It mentions 2 characteristics. Remember when I was talking about the dimensions of health, I said signpost the characteristics, because that's going to give you the highest quality responses. They've done this here. They've signposted self-esteem and confidence levels. And then they've mentioned finally that it's impacting the mental health and well-being. All right, so effectively, this could be a 3-mark question, but it's only 2. You're getting 1 mark for explaining what body image is, another one for explaining that it affects the characteristics of self-esteem and confidence levels, and this comes under the mental dimension of health. So it's probably a 1, a 0.5, and a 0.5. But that's what an in-depth answer for a 2-mark question should look like. Not, I see some answers on SACs that we've given, and that's okay. We're just starting out this, just as a little bit of feedback, where it's a response would be body image is they don't feel too good about how they look, so they have no confidence, or they don't feel good about how they look. This affects their mental health. That's not where it needs to be as an answer, because it's not going through those steps, explaining those things I need to see. It's not signposting the characteristics and then explaining the dimension. If you just state the dimension, it's not going to be enough. You need to signpost those characteristics. So I'll go on about it so much, but it's easy marks. All right, moving on. Sort of get this through. It's a bit of a long video, so you might want to watch it 1.5. Let's skip over some. So I haven't put any notes down in terms of priorities. So when we're looking at priorities, we're just looking at priorities of different demographics of people in the population and how their priorities can differ. How can someone's priorities in terms of their health and well-being differ depending on their age? How can their priorities differ depending on their religion or their ethnicity or some of their behaviours? So effectively, that's what this topic is looking at. You should remember this. I think we spent a decent amount of time on this. So I'm going to go straight to the questions. So, state the dimension of health and well-being that people of all ages are likely to prioritise when considering health. So the example answer that I got is that people of all ages are likely to prioritise physical health and well-being. Why is this? Most diseases and illnesses most directly impact the physical dimension of health. Hence, that's probably a comment there. Hence why it is a dimension which is prioritised at all ages. However, this perspective may change at a young age. We may be concerned with physical fitness and aesthetics. At an older age, we may focus on the functioning of body systems and the absence of disease. Right, so this is a 1 mark question, but the response that I've given here, if this were to be a 3 mark question, which it probably should be, it says 1 mark in the textbook, but if I was making this question, I'd, at least 2 marks, 1 mark for stating the dimension of health, 1 mark for how it's a priority at a young age and how it's a priority at an older age. It'll probably be a 3 mark question, so hence why I've got a long response. But I'll show you how to tackle a question like this. All right, so I've clearly identified some of the priorities that an individual might have at a younger age. What are they going to be concerned with? They're not going to be so concerned with the functioning of body systems and organs and the absence of disease and illness, because a lot of younger people aren't faced with that reality yet. So they think of their physical health in a different light. They think of physical fitness. How do I perform physically if I'm going to play sport? I'm competing against my friends. How's my fitness in that realm? And also, how do I look? I mentioned before, if I'm talking about how I look physically, and I'm talking about the physical dimension of health, I can't refer to body image, because body image is your own perception. So how I can do that and keep it within the physical realm is use the term physical aesthetics, because that's referring to how someone looks objectively. Their body fat percentage, how much muscle density have they got, how much muscle mass. Your own perception is your body image. Hence why I've used the word aesthetics. So if you want to steal that in your answers, it's a really good idea to do that. Then I've said, well, at an older age, our focus becomes a lot more fragile, and we see that reality a lot more. So we focus on the functioning of body systems, the well-being of our organs, and effectively just the absence of illness and disease, not getting sick, not getting any serious illnesses or diseases, cancer, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease. As we get older, that reality becomes more apparent, and that becomes more of a focus. So try and stay really relevant to the demographics and the age groups that you're talking about. When you're answering this, don't go, we want to be physically fit because we're young and active. Once again, that's the sort of response that's not going to, or we're not going to get you any marks. Be specific about characteristics. I'll answer that one pretty quick. Might need to spend a bit of time on Indigenous perspectives, because I feel like this is one, when we answer the SAT questions, we just were a little bit off the mark. So the first thing that we're going to be looking at when we're looking at Indigenous perspectives, and how Indigenous perspectives differ from non-Indigenous perspectives. So firstly, if we look at non-Indigenous perspectives for a little bit of context, I mentioned sort of in the last response in chapter 1.5, the main concern people have is their physical health and well-being. That is predominantly, a non-Indigenous perspective. The Indigenous perspective, the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander perspective, exists in a little bit of a different realm, whereas the priorities are slightly different to how the rest of the population prioritizes their health and well-being. And that is because specific cultural practices, and we'll speak about those cultural practices. The culture is a central part of health and well-being for First Nations people. Retaining traditional cultural practices that can have a positive health outcome across all 5 dimensions of health. So there's a strong interrelationship between retaining culture and positive outcomes across all 5 dimensions. And that's been empirically stated through data and evidence studies, hence why culture is so important in terms of retaining health and well-being for the Indigenous population. So we look at some of the implications for physical health. So, when we look at physical health, we go, okay, well, how does the average person in the population maintain their physical health? Have a good diet, be physically active, be active most of the day, try and keep your energy levels high, be well rested, get enough sleep, all those sorts of standard physical things that we do to maintain physical health and well-being. But for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, it happens in a little bit of a different way. So it has shown that people who maintain a connection to cultural practices such as language were at a lower risk of ill health in relation to the functioning of body systems such as cardiovascular disease and showed increased physical fitness. So connection to culture has a very strong connection to community and social health and well-being. And in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, being connected enables people to live a healthier, more active lifestyle and improve parts of their health, like diet and physical activity and traditional practice that involve being physically active. So retaining culture, and an example of that culture could be language, but it could be other things. It could be things like eating bush tucker, traditional hunting practices. All these sorts of things can contribute to physical health. So retaining culture and maintaining culture through different practices has an effect on all dimensions of health. And this is just an example of how it affects physical health. So if you were to give an example in the question that you wanted to say about retaining culture and how it can impact physical health, you could speak about traditional hunting practices and eating bush tucker as an example of how an Indigenous person can improve their physical health and well-being through the retention of culture. So that's how culture relates to health and well-being. It's something you need to remember for the exam, because there's going to be a fairly there's going to be a decent amount of information on this part of the chapter that you need to remember, and a lot of information you need to analyze. So be mindful of that. The next part that we're going to be looking at, is connection to land. So connection to land is somewhat interrelated to culture, but it's kept in sort of a different section. So connection to land is a critical component once again, and it has implications across all 5 dimensions of health. It doesn't just affect physical health, it affects lots of dimensions of health. So connection to land is referred to as second skin. Good idea to use this term as second skin within your responses, because it shows real in-depth knowledge of what connection to land is. Strong connection will provide people with increased mental well-being, as this connection and care for land leads to lower stress levels and confidence through empowering properties of this connection. So we'll unpack this a little bit. So if the connection to land is second skin, if that connection to land is absent, or that connection to land is at risk or at danger from being damaged, this can cause high levels of stress, because it is an integral part of First Nations people's it's an integral part of their culture, but it's also an integral part of their being as an individual. So this is something to consider, that connection to land has implications, not just physical implications, because we could talk about connection to land as a way of empowering active and physical lifestyle. Being out on country, using those traditional practices out on country is going to be physically beneficial. We could see that link. But in terms of the mental benefits of being out in country and being out in bush, is that it lowers people's stress levels and it empowers them and increases their confidence, because they know that this is the traditional practice, or this is the traditional connection that they've had through their spirituality and through their ancestors. It's very important to retain this today and in the future. So it will lower stress levels and confidence. So that's a connection that you can make about connection to land. The physical benefits of having connection to land, as I mentioned before, they're easy ones to link, because they promote an active lifestyle, but they've also got an emotional and mental component. Right. So the third component of First Nations people in terms of health and well-being is the concept of social and emotional health and well-being. So this is the 7 characteristics that encompass social and emotional health and well-being. So community, body, mind and emotions, family and kinship, spirit and spirituality, country and culture. So these 5 concepts, you'll notice that they're very communal and holistic in terms of how they're presented. We look at things like community, culture, family and kinship, spirituality, and ancestors. These are concepts that are all very communal. So you'll notice a recurring theme in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders perspectives is that the focus on health is less individual and it's more communal. And the communal effect of health and well-being goes back to the individual, has a direct effect on the individual. So retaining good health within the community, good social and emotional interactions within the community empowers the health of the individual. So you need to make that link when you're talking about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives specifically. It's actually a good case study that I'm not going to read it out for you, but it's a good idea to have a read of this. It speaks about the health implications of being out on country and going bush during the COVID pandemic, and some of the benefits that this had for individuals in the Indigenous community. So the example I've used here, or the example answer, is for is actually for question 3, not question 2. I don't know what's it. For question 3. So identify one example of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander culture and suggest how this example affects health and well-being. So the response I've got is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture includes speaking their native language. This can help maintain relationships with others in the community, also speak the language, promoting positive relationships. So this is social health and well-being. So this shows the benefits of retaining culture, and a part of culture is language. And then how does this link to one of the dimensions of health? You pick out one of the dimensions of health, so social health and well-being. Okay, well, if language is retained, it's easier to build strong relationships. We know that's a part of social health and well-being, so we're making that link there. So being able to link Indigenous perspectives to the 5 dimensions of health is going to be really important. So you could be getting a question like, what are the benefits of being out on country in taking part in traditional practices? And you could say, well, one of the benefits to one of the dimensions is being out on country empowers the Indigenous population to lead a more active lifestyle and intake a healthier diet. Therefore, it makes them more physically fit. It can decrease the risk of cardiovascular disease and can improve body function in terms of their body systems and organs. So that's an example of how you could take an Indigenous perspective and relate it to one of the dimensions of health. So it's important that you're able to do that and you understand how that works and some of the different ways that can be linked. That is all for chapter 1. So what I suggest is that you watch over this video, even if you watch parts of the video. But most importantly, you go over these annotations that I've put up on the OneNote, and you, at the very least, take down the notes of the key information that you don't know, that you have some gaps in your knowledge. Fill those gaps. It's very important you know this stuff for the exam. And if you don't do this, if you hop on the OneNote, you go, oh, I'll be right. I've done a few questions. I don't need to have a look over the annotations that Sir's put up. It's not that important. I guarantee you get to exam day and you're going to wish you had a look at the annotations because, there was a question on something that he explained. There was a question that could have been answered with one of the notes that he put up there. So make sure you take a good look at that because it's really going to help you. And also watching the video is going to be beneficial. Obviously, if you got to this point, you've watched all the video. But I'll put up a few more videos. It's a really good idea to watch them because it explains some of the ways that you structure your responses and how you can improve that, because that's the best way you're going to take content knowledge to the level of strong content application. A lot of us are at the level of like decent content knowledge. Okay, we know most of the content. We can mention most of the dimensions of health. But how do we apply it in a case study type question? Yeah, maximum marks. That's where some of us are still just falling off slightly. And as time goes on, we can certainly adjust that. And if you're diligent and you take note of this advice, then you will be able to improve that really, really quickly. You'll be able to improve that before exam time, which is ultimately your goal. All right, so that'll do me for now. Make sure that you have a look at the video, or have a look at the next video that I'll put up, because I feel like these would be somewhat beneficial. Even if you just, if it's parts you don't know, you skip over parts. If you felt like you missed out on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives, or you think you missed out chapter 2.3, skip over to when I'm talking about that, so you can digest that information. But yeah, that'll do me for tonight.